Welcome to the Ford Innovate 191 sales event, driving better SUV value for you. Take the new Ford EcoSport, featuring Ford Sync navigation with touchscreen, Ford Pass with Wi-Fi connectivity, rear-view camera, parking sensors and cruise control. And right now, you can order a 191 Ford EcoSport with an amazing 7-year warranty, 7-year roadside assistance and 2 years free servicing. All from just €23,525. Ford Innovate, driving better value for you. See it for yourself at your local participating Ford dealer. Offer ends March 31st. Ford, go further. Price excludes delivery and related charges. Terms and conditions apply. See Ford.ie for details.
He started to hit well and all of a sudden became a cult hero and, won Rookie of the Year. He's still beloved in Cleveland. He's still the man up there. He still lives up there.
Crazy. He would dye his hair. He opened beer bottles with his eyelid, I think, or something.
Yeah, his eye socket. Yeah, I mean, he used to fight. He used to participate in bare knuckle boxing matches in boxcars for money.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Donut Bag, part of the Pod Hub Network. In this episode, I review a book called Phinally, The Phillies, the Royals, and the 1980 baseball season that almost wasn't, from McFarland, with author Jay Daniel. This book covers everything that happened in the 1980 season with interesting facts and entertaining stories. It is a must-read for anyone that watched baseball in the 80s. The Donut Bag starts right now. Okay, now for a book review. I have a book called Phinally, The Phillies, the Royals, and the 1980 baseball season that almost wasn't, published by McFarland. I have the author Jay Daniel with me. How you doing, sir?
I am great. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Doing great. So, when I first saw the title, I thought, oh, is this just a book about the Phillies? Like, I like the Phillies. Well, no, I don't like the Phillies. I'm from Pittsburgh, but
right.
It's like, oh god, is this just a whole book about the Phillies? Yeah, but no, it is a book chronicling the entire 1980 season in baseball. So, why did you choose 1980?
Well, I grew up a Phillies fan, and I turned 13 a couple of weeks after that World Series ended, and so when you have a team that wins a championship in that area, I would say that age area for you, I think that becomes a special team. And so that was one of the things. And I actually started off to write a book about the entire decade. Ran into some issues there. One of the biggest issues is just trying to condense an entire baseball season into, between 20 and 30 pages. And so I did so much research, fell down so many rabbit holes that I thought, well, I better just move on with 1980 because I already had a lot of content built up from that. So that was why I chose to focus on 1980, and it also left the door open for me to do some other things about some other years as well, which I'm hoping to do in the future.
Yeah. Like I said before the call, you're going to need to do one for each year because you did such a good job on this, and this wasn't just you didn't just list facts, you didn't just list. It could have easily just, said, oh, this team beat this team, and blah, blah, blah. No, you went into all detail of all the things that happened with basically each team. There's so many crazy stories, so many great quotes. We can't even list them all, but that has to be a special thing as a 13-year-old to get a championship. When did you start to first follow baseball?
I was, 6, 7, 8 years old. I mean, I grew up in Southwest Ohio, so I grew up in Big Red Machine Country, but I was a Phillies fan. My parents are from Pennsylvania. My mom grew up in Philadelphia till she moved away in high school, and she told me, she was a Phillies fan, and when you're 5 or 6 years old or whatever it is, that's as good enough a reason as any to root for a team. So I started following the Phillies, and then they were good. At that period of time, and they won the division in 76, 77, and 78, so that kind of hooked me. Of course, the Reds were around, but I think what kind of helps was one of my best friends at the time was not a Reds fan either, and so he and I were kind of the outliers. We liked teams other than the Reds growing up in that era, but I've said before, my friends were pretending to be Johnny Bench in the backyard when I was pretending to be Larry Bowa. So.
Now, as a kid in Ohio, how are you following the Phillies?
It's tough. I mean, that's one of the biggest things that struck me in doing this book is how much different the experience of being a fan is now as compared to what it was then. I mean, it was difficult to follow the Phillies. The only time I ever saw them on TV was if they were a Saturday night game, Saturday afternoon, the game of the week, or Monday Night Baseball, which of course used to be a huge thing, or if they played the Reds. And even then, back in 1980, there were not a whole lot of Reds games on TV. None of the home games were on TV. And maybe if they went on the road for, an 8-game road trip or whatever, maybe 2 or 3 of those, maybe one game from each city would be on TV. So it was difficult to follow teams that weren't in your area at the time. And again, you compare that today where, you can watch. I was once at a chiropractor's office watching an A's Mariners game live on my phone. Compare that to, growing up in a National League city, I never saw Rod Carew. I never saw Jim Rice. I never saw Reggie Jackson in person, So it was just a completely different era.
It was so different. It was so there was no interleague play. There was no you just heard about these American League teams.
Right.
And the only time you really got to see him is either the World Series or the All-Star game.
Yep.
And that's why the All-Star game was so special. It's like, oh wow, they're playing each other. Who are these people? Yeah. But the Phillies, I had no idea they were so terrible for decades up until the 70s.
They were really bad. They had there was one season in the 40s where I think they finished 62 and a half games out of first place, something like that. They had a lot of bad luck, and then they would have, they kind of pop out of nowhere, and they were good but it was literally 1 year each time. Once in 1915 where they lost in the World Series to Babe Ruth and the Red Sox, and then once in 1950 with the Whiz Kids when they got swept in the World Series by the Yankees. But then they, just as quickly as they became good, they got bad again. And then, of course, there was the collapse in 64 where they had, I don't remember exactly what the numbers were, an 8-game lead with 12 to play or something like that, and they lost 10 in a row. And but then they finally started to draft well, and they had, they got Schmidt, they got Boa, they got Lazinski and Bob Boone, and these guys became the base for that team that made some noise in the 70s and early 80s. And so it was finally, pun intended, no pun intended, a good time to be a Phillies fan after years and years of struggling for people in that area.
Yeah, and they were loaded in 1980. Schmidt was the MVP at 48 home runs. Steve Carlton won the Cy Young, 24-9 with a 2.34 ERA. Pete Rose was on the team. He was 39 at the time, but he had 185 hits. They were just loaded. But as loaded as they were, it was still an extremely close race in that NL East.
It really was, and I think it's easy to overlook how talented the Expos of that era were. Again, you talk about, in theory, on paper, let's put it, at the time in 1980, the Phillies had 3 future Hall of Famers, Pete Rose's issues notwithstanding, right, with Schmidt and Rose and Carlton. Then you look at the Expos, they've got Raines, although actually Raines didn't come up, and he played a tiny bit in 1980, but you've got Dawson, you've got Carter, you've got guys that were really, really good players, and Ellis Valentine, some other just really, really talented players. Ron LaFleur stole 97 bases that year for Montreal. So that was a really talented team, and they had some good pitching as well. And then, of course, obviously the Pirates had won the World Series the year before, so there was still a lot of talent on that team. And the Pirates, had a really kind of on-again, off-again season, struggled. They kind of went in the tank at the end of August and never recovered. But again, you're talking about the defending world champs at the time, so They still had pops. They had Dave Parker, and Jim Bibby kind of came out of nowhere and had that fantastic season, won 19 games. So there was a lot of talent there. That season came right down to the wire.
Yeah, I'm a little bit younger than you. My very first season following baseball was 1983. So I was right after those, after the World Series, and then Pirates were still kind of okay in 80 and 81 and 82, and 83 they were pretty good. And then the mid 80s they just fell apart. It was that was depressing. But one thing about those 80 Pirates, you talk about an incident that happened with Dave Parker and a battery.
Yeah.
That was I think I think Dave Parker committed the horrible crime of being the first $1 million player.
I think the crime that Dave Parker committed was not being Willie Stargell.
Yeah.
I think Pops was on his way out. That was his age 39 or 40 season. Cobra was 29, kind of in the prime of his career, approaching the prime of his career. He had a down year in 79, but he still had a decent year. He still hit right around 300. And that's one of the mysteries for me as somebody that didn't grow up in that area, of just why the hate for Dave Parker. I've never really understood it. He was a phenomenal player from all I've heard, a pretty good guy, at least now. I don't know what he was like in 1979, but yeah, that's a really interesting thing. And you said, that was the big, kind of a pretty famous incident. It was actually on a day where they were honoring Willie Stargell as a doubleheader, and somebody threw in a battery and almost hit him in the back of the head. He ended up sitting out the second game of the doubleheader and asked to be traded. And I think once it was sort of a perfect storm where he was upset. Someone did something stupid. He got upset. I don't want to say he overreacted, because had that battery hit him, it could have caused serious damage. But he said what he said, and then the fans piled on, and all of a sudden it got ugly quickly. And that was sort of the beginning of the end for him in Pittsburgh, which is a shame, because, a fantastic player, borderline Hall of Famer, and, he's a guy that could have carried the Pirates, just taken that mantle from Pops and moved on. And it's a shame that it kind of ended poorly for him in Pittsburgh.
Yeah, it's the one thing about the salaries, Parker was the first $1 million player. I think he got that contract in 77 or something like that. The salaries back then, somebody signing a 4-year, $2 million contract or something, and that being considered like a lot of money.
Yeah. It was. Again, just that was right at the beginning of the free agency era, and so that was back when they still had a free agent draft too, right? It wasn't the case that you said, "Hey, I'm a free agent," and teams came bidding. There was a re-entry draft, and teams could select guys, and you could only negotiate with teams that had drafted you, and so the big thing with that coming into 1980 was that Nolan Ryan became the first player to sign a deal that averaged $1 million a year, and that was just outrageous, at the time. And of course now, obviously things have changed a little bit, but again, it just speaks to how different the game is now. And I don't want to be the get off my lawn guy and say well, in my day everything was better, but I think there was something to it. There was still some romance to it, still some, it was still some innocence to the game at the time, and I think a lot of that's gone away now.
Yeah. It's funny. Some players, they would get into negotiations, and they would have bitter negotiations over like $10,000 or something like that.
Yeah. It was crazy.
Yeah. So part of the title is the 1980 baseball season that almost wasn't. How close were they to a strike? And I'm sure it was related to some of those quote unquote big salaries.
Yeah, they were extremely close to a strike. Basically, the strike that took place in 1981 should have occurred in 1980.
Yeah.
And all the issues were the same. And basically, what happened was that the players had they walked out of spring training for the last week. And then they set a strike date of Memorial Day weekend, and they chose that weekend. The players chose that weekend on purpose because they knew that that would be the biggest weekend to cause financial harm to the owners, because that's kind of the, quote unquote, beginning of the summer, big attendance weekend.